Curtis and Jimmy, I think.
Yes.
Got both of you. Excellent. How's the conference going?
It's good. It's just, we're running around trying to do this conference and carving out some time to be at this conference.
This is your third presentation today, isn't it?
This is only number 2 today. I got one more to go after this.
Wonderful, wonderful. Mary, just making sure that you've got Curtis and Jimmy locked on there. Jimmy, what's the presentation about today? What are you guys going to talk about?
It's securing developers, and it's more of an ID, preventing vulnerabilities from going downstream. So it's moving security detection as early in the life cycle as possible. And Curtis is going to kind of set the table for that before we kind of talk about the tooling that we have to help developers prevent introducing vulnerabilities right downstream. So it's more.
I had to laugh when you said securing developers. All I could think of is a straitjacket, because that's
honestly, when I first heard the title, I was like, this sounds like we're physically restraining.
Let's restrain them. Yeah.
It's
the only.
Curtis, you want to share your screen and we can get you guys going?
Yes, I do. Let's share.
I'm assuming you guys got some introductions for yourself there. I didn't introduce you, just started in right away. So I'm going to go in the background, and it's up to you. I'll be here if you need help.
Alrighty, Mark. Thanks so much. So I'm Kurt Yanko. You can see here, DevSecOps evangelist coach. I recently have a really teeny book out, so I can claim author as well. And that's just sort of, where my passion is. But I also manage I'm involved with our global alliances work, which includes our relationship with folks like Micro Focus.
Yep. James Rabon. I'm the Fortify product manager. Background is in application security consulting. I come from the development and application security PS side. So I've been a practitioner of application security, most specifically static and dynamic analysis tools. So more of my focus is on unknown vulnerabilities in custom code. And so that's probably the experience I bring to the table.
Awesome. And with that, we're going to get going. This is a tight time slot, so we're going to get moving here quickly. And just so folks know, at the end of this, Jimmy has to run. He has another presentation 5 minutes after this ends, because that's how we roll here today. Yep. But I will stick around and try and answer it best I can in the Q&A session. All right, so our talk starts with Mr. Deming. This came originally from Derek, and this is a talk we've given a lot, but it really sets the tone for the talk we want to give today. And it's this notion that in 1945, post-war Europe, America, and Japan, he was able to start consulting with Japanese manufacturing to start to rebuild their country. And a lot of what Deming brings to the table is this idea of ceasing mass inspections late in the production line, and we can think automotive, versus just learning how to build quality in. And they started doing something completely counterintuitive, which was stopping the production line to address issues as they were happening and not letting it continue to flow down the line. And that was the sort of behavior that would have got you fired at GM or Ford at the same time, right? So it came as no surprise then in 2010 when Jez Humble released the now seminal work on continuous delivery, that he was citing Deming and talking about building quality in. And everyone's been, this was at a time in my career where the idea of the cost curve was well known by everyone in IT. And earlier in the life cycle, you can find problems and fix them, the less cost there is to you. So in a purely financial sense, but also it just it starts to really pay off in spades as we see from successful customers. And then it just almost becomes predictable when you get to 2013 and Gene Kim releasing the Phoenix project, where again, citing Deming and a lot of that work while I was on Gold Rat's the Goal, it's this idea of emphasizing the performance of the entire system and never passing a defect downstream. So hopefully by now we've sort of picked up on the theme. Now, having said that, we at Sonatype have done the 2019 DevSecOps Community Survey. It was one of the largest surveys ever done with about 5,500 responses. So that makes it pretty statistically significant. And in it, we've asked people if they could release multiple times a week, and 47% of the respondents indicated that they could release multiple times a week, which is a clear indicator that everybody's trying to go faster. We know there's competitive pressures. Not only is everyone trying to go faster, a lot of people are actually going faster. Sadly, with that increased rate, and this number is a little dated now, this number I believe is from March, so it was a couple of months before the 1-year anniversary of GDPR, but there have been 59,000 different incidences reported to the GDPR. Now, only 4 have resulted in fines to date, but it's pretty clear that while we're going faster, we're not necessarily doing it in a more secure way, at least not yet. So what Jimmy and I, and in our relationship with Micro Focus is, we for a long time have relied heavily on doing static code analysis and dynamic testing and traditional tools that have been around for most of my career. But it comes as a bit of a surprise to a lot of folks that is on average about 80% of an application is made up of open source libraries that are sort of borrowed from the internet, or is essentially saying external suppliers, right? So, and these are really powerful. They're a big part of what enables the velocity, because our developers get to focus on our business logic, and we don't have to write how to talk to a database or how to write a log file or all these other things that we just sort of take for granted now. And they've already been, they're already out there, and no one wants to reinvent that wheel.
Kurt, let me jump in real quick. We're
Sure.
having troubles with the video. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the system. So nobody can see your slides. So the more you can describe, the better. And then we'll get people the slide deck afterwards.
All righty, Mark. Thanks for the heads up. Yeah, so this one's easy to describe because it's kind of a pie chart showing an 80-20. Going on is not going to be so here we have a slide that's just showing the demand by ecosystems. NPM leads the way, followed by Java, NuGet, PyPy, Ruby. But there's basically 15,000 new releases every day. So the sheer volume and variety that's out there is only growing at alarming rates. As the caretakers of Maven Central, or the central repository now, we alone serviced 146 billion downloads last year. NPM had a ridiculous number of 7 billion, and I believe that was just for like 1 month or something. I forget the exact nature of that stat, but the NPM download rates are shockingly huge, partially because there's just so many different packages that download similar components multiple times. So there's sort of just a broader ecosystem. What we know also from our survey and our understanding of Maven Central, and this is just some number on the slide for Java, but there's the average enterprise has about 170,000 component versions that they're using. There's about 3,500 components, but spread out across versions. So there's just a massive download rate. And in NPM, there's about 60,000 packages. So it's a little counterintuitive. It seems like a smaller number, but I think they download and re-download over and over in the JavaScript world. So we see the consumption rates are really high. The bad news is that not all of these things are created equal. There's a lot of bad parts out there that are known and documented. And so when we look at those download rates and we do some math, and we get another pie chart here that suggests that 10% of all the downloads from the central repository include known vulnerable components, which is shockingly high. The NPM world is even more shockingly disturbing at 51% download rate with known vulnerable components. And for anyone who's a student of Six Sigma and Lean and some of this stuff, if we put these numbers on a little graph reminding people of defect targets within Six Sigma, NPM's at a sigma of 1, Java's at a sigma of 2. And I like to point out at this point in time that we would find these failure rates completely unacceptable in our food chain or our pharmaceuticals or just about any other thing in our life other than software. So that's the shocking thing. And so the point we're trying to drive this towards is developers are really on our front line, and this is where DevSecOps kick in. And how can we work together holistically and make this work for everyone, and not have late lifecycle mass inspections for security that is not really timely as far as the developers are concerned. And I like to show lots and lots of developers on here to remind us that AppSec professionals are outnumbered 100 to 1 in most organizations. And just a few minutes ago, Jimmy pointed out to me that the largest AppSec teams in the world don't exceed 20. That might be some of the largest teams in the world are about 20 AppSec professionals supporting tens of thousands of developers.
Yep.
So having said that, the developers are not ignorant of this. They're not unaware. They're not uncaring. Again, we go back to our survey and look at some findings over the last 3 years. They've consistently reported that about 50% believe that security is very important, but they also point out that they don't have enough time to spend on it. I have an old CIO that talks about time as a proxy for priority. So this tells me that in these organizations, these issues are not a priority, and therefore we're not allocating time or money or energy towards them. So the developers are very aware and want to help, but they're not really being empowered or incentivized to do so.
I would also add too, in my role of product manager, obviously I'm deciding what features to go and build. That's not the sexiest feature to upgrade Angular from Angular 1 to Angular 2, right?
No, you're absolutely right.
So it definitely is a balancing act between
Yeah.
security and the competition and time to market.
Yeah, it's a little hard to show up to your daily Scrum and like, what did I do yesterday? I updated some packages. And what are you going to do today? I'm going to update some more packages. Like, that's not what people want to hear at Scrum, right?
Yep.
But all of this, when we pull the lens back and think about this, we're effectively saying we're downloading known defects at alarming rates. We know it's a problem, but we're not addressing it. And then we have security professionals who have an overwhelming volume of defects that they're trying to triage and just understand what are the ones that we can actually try to address, because there's just too many. And if we just step back for a second, it falls into this quote from Diane Vaughan, this idea of social normalization of deviance, where we're very aware of all of this, and yet we've somehow accepted all of this as being our normal day-to-day standard operating procedure, which is a little mind-boggling, except that we've been, I don't know, treading water for so long and trying to keep our nose just above the waterline that it's all we can think about. So in other shocking news, this one has two charts from 2014 and 2019. I don't know if we have any video working again, but in 2014, there was about a 14% increase, or no, 14% of our respondents had verified that they felt that they had been affected by a breach related to open source. And in 2019, that went up to 24%. So increasingly, they're either increasingly aware or it's increasingly happening, or both. But it's on the rise. It's certainly not on the decline. But now we're talking about essentially 1 in 4 companies out there can say they know that they've had some, what we like to often hear is a compelling event.
Yeah, I'd also add too here, I mean, this echoes true in even my own product, right? We're leveraging these open source components so we can quickly build features and and win in the market, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a vendor or you're making soda or whatever, but it is increasing the complexity of these applications, and it's creating there's less transparency, right? Of someone who understands the full code base. Right, you have hundreds of thousands of lines of code that you did not write. You may be instantiating a small amount of those, but you do not understand your application is not 25,000 lines. It's 650,000 lines.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, it's definitely true. We have more apps and more interconnections and more overall complexity, and it's becoming just increasingly difficult to manage.
Yeah, I saw a talk Netflix gave where they explained, and this guy was incredibly smart, and he said there is not a single person in Netflix that can explain how Netflix works. There is not a single person in the organization. It is so complex end to end, and that is to provide you movies on a web page.
We had the same thing at my insurance.
So what do you think the missile defense or these important systems?
We had at the insurance company I worked at prior to coming to Sonatype, we had someone like nobody could tell you what happens from the time a claim comes in the front door and a payment goes out the back door. Nobody knows everything that happens for a claim. Absolutely. So it's the same thing, and it's just because we've just grown and there's just so much going on. All right. The other really disturbing trend with all of this, and that further really highlights the need to get this at the beginning of the process and empower developers, is that the amount of time that exploits come out has dropped dramatically. I've been involved in application development throughout this chart, which starts in 2006, where it was about 45 days. And the stat is, how long did it take a CVSS 9 or 10 to turn into basically an exploit you could buy on the dark web, right? So it was 45 days back in 2006. And I remember that, and I remember even we used to have a working thing of about a month in our head. We said you really got about 30 days, but if you fast forward to 2017, we had Equifax that happened in 2 or 3 days, depending on who you ask, and you also have a security guy for the NSA at Black Hat that same year gave a talk that says they routinely see attacks coming within the first 24 hours of exploits being announced, or vulnerabilities being announced, I should say.
It would seem that black hat hackers have also adopted DevOps principles.
I've often said that they're doing a better job at DevOps than we are because they're releasing more frequently. They probably have less quality constraints, though.
Sure, right. QA is probably lacking.
Yeah. But so if we go back to that initial stat where we shared that 47% of our respondents said that they can release multiple times a week, that's the cohort you want to be in. If you can release multiple times a week, you have a fighting chance to patch within this 2 or 3 day time frame. This is really what we're up against, at least in the open source side of the equation. If you're not, then it means you're going to have to get there. You're really at risk because you can't even if you have the awareness and the visibility and a complete bill of materials, you still probably can't respond in time, even if you go your fastest. So it's interesting to see that develop. And so just to revisit that, the famous Struts incident from 2017, and what we like to point out here is this is quite possibly the most well-known, most talked about in all the mass media, vulnerability of our time. Everybody in the world knows that there are vulnerable versions of Struts that can lead to, an untrusted serialization and a remote code execution, and that leads to nothing good. And yet, if this chart, which shows the download trends of that component going back to March of 17, and it kind of fast forwards to November of 2018, and really after it was announced, after the news broke that we now know this is a vulnerable component, so that really the 0 day back in July, and the patch that was out, we see the download trends of that component actually just continue to grow, right? They're certainly not declining, and that's really disturbing. And so this is the kind of thing that gives us pause at Sonatype in particular, and our Micro Focus as well, is why is that, right? And if everybody knows this, but it's still kind of going through, it sort of implies either you don't have a bill of materials and developers don't know. The people that need to know the most are probably the ones that are not well informed.
Yeah, I would say it's that, and also too with the larger, more complex frameworks, the difficulty of upgrading is much higher, right, than smaller, unzip utility, for example. It's obviously a no-brainer. Struts is a very complex, right?
No, you're absolutely right. Yep, and then and it comes with if you're a greenfield app and you're sort of managing this all the time, if this is a priority that you're allocating time to, you won't accumulate that technical debt that puts you in that position.
Absolutely.
So I get it from a legacy app standpoint, it's damn near impossible, but there's not a good excuse from 2015 going forward, because this is in the OWASP top 10.
Absolutely.
So at any rate, speaking of who can and can't do a complete software bill of materials, again, our DevSecOps community survey indicated that about half of our self-identified, this is a key component to this, so we asked them to identify where they are in their maturity, and amongst the people who identified themselves as mature, only 50% were able to do this, what I think is really important, and some of them may not be as mature as they think they are, the other 50%. Whereas people with no DevOps practices, the number drops to 19. So we see where DevOps practices does start to elevate this awareness, but there's also room to improve even amongst groups that identify themselves as mature. So the DevSecOps challenge, and I think Jimmy and I hinted at it a minute ago, because they're doing DevOps better than we are, so we have to automate faster than evil. And this is where the only way this is going to work for us is we got to enlist the developers on the front lines to be thinking about this stuff during the construction phase, so that by the time that software leaves at the end of the sprint, I don't know if that's a week or 2 weeks, depends on your team, but ideally when it does leave the sprint, anything that was known and identifiable and easy to deal with has been dealt with. And maybe there's things that can't be dealt with, but at least they're understood, and we can start to think about mitigating controls through other security mechanisms, but at least we have the awareness and we've driven down as much as we can.
Yeah, and I would say too, in my world where we're dealing with, we're looking at vulnerabilities, 0-day essentially attacks, right? This is custom code. We're modeling it. We find the vulnerability, improving the quality of our results so that you can build automation on top of that is also, kind of a key part of being able to automate faster than evil. You can't automate with bad data set.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So we're coming near the end. So now we're going to talk. Now we've posed the problem. We've positioned what we think some of the issues are. So of course, it wouldn't be a Nexus user conference without showing a little something from Nexus Lifecycle. But key to our solution is putting this kind of information right in front of developers in their IDE at the time of coding. And really, what we're trying to highlight here, it's a bit of an eye chart if you guys can see this. But we're showing the developer that 8 or so components here are flagged red. They are policy violations that will result in this code not being allowed to go to production, assuming such controls are in place. And then on the right side, without getting into all the details of exactly what the issue is and call flow analysis and all this, we can show you at a glance. You just got to find a green bar with no red squares under it. And that's the version number you want to move to make that little policy violation go away. Ideally, one developer on that team does that throughout the sprint so that the number of reds in here is at its absolute minimal, the things that can be addressed. And hopefully hopefully it's just because there is no known good version out there, not because you're in a position of technical debt and can't update it. So this is how we at Sonatype empower developers for our customers who have embraced this and really used it. We've seen tremendous results and have case studies out there. But it's not enough just to give them to the developers. It also sort of needs to be throughout the life cycle mostly because what we don't want to do is necessarily break the build. Breaking the build is not really the way to go. That doesn't help a lot of folks. But where you want to try and stop this is from, at some point after test, you shouldn't be deploying if it hasn't passed all of your tests. I think that's a safe generic statement to make about all testing.
Sure.
So we see ourselves as just one type of test. Obviously, we have static code analysis, dynamic testing, functional performance, right? All those things are on the table.
Complexity, code quality, all that stuff.
All of those things are on the table, but that's why our platform is designed to empower early and never pass that defect downstream. But we can also, break it at an appropriate point, pull that andon cord, stop the line where it makes the most sense. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our firewall upstream of the developers to block net new known vulnerable components from even entering the supply chain or the manufacturing process in this case. By applying that policy upstream and just alerting them at the earliest possible moment that maybe this isn't the component for you and you might need to find an alternative version or an alternative library altogether.
Yep.
And with that, I'm going to let Jimmy speak to Security Assist.
Yeah, so we build a static analysis product which is very good at doing deep dive data flow analysis. The challenge with that is obviously it's very memory intensive and complex, and it can take some time when you're talking about very complex systems that are hundreds of thousands or million of lines of code. So we saw a need for a lightweight security spell checker that would allow developers to prevent certain types of vulnerabilities from ever really being committed into a source repository. So this is as early in the life cycle as we can get. And developers are very familiar with how IntelliSense or other helping type utilities are in the IDE. That's the whole point of an IDE, is to help you build applications faster and better. So we wanted to bring custom vulnerability detection into the IDE. This happens in less than a second as you type code. We are doing intra-class data flow, meaning that if the entry point and exit point of data flow occurs in a class, I can show you in less than a second that there's a potential vulnerability there and allow the developer to immediately fix it in code, right? And then immediately the vulnerability goes away. So it's not reported anywhere. It's meant to be an assistance, and it provides the details, category, and the priority of the issue based on the impact and likelihood of the vulnerability. It's not as robust as our full static analysis product, but it runs in less than a second as you type code.
Yeah. I mean, I get excited by stuff like this because it's so culturally normal now for us, spell checkers in general, writing your email or whatever.
Grammarly is another
right. So
one,
we're
yeah.
all sort of culturally on board, and it's just the timeliness of the feedback, right? It's right then in the moment while I'm thinking about it to have something pop up and say, you might want to think about this a little bit more.
For sure. Yeah, and it's completely up to the developer whether to use it or not, right? It's all exists inside of the IDE. If you go to the next slide, we can look at the actual. We have, for a long time developed static analysis products, which is great, which means we have, hundreds of thousands of rules, right, that are written by our security research group, which includes details, coding samples of the vulnerability, and recommendations of how to fix the vulnerability. So, SQL injection, for example, here, this is exactly what it is. We all know dynamically created SQL statements are bad. Here's how you write parameterized queries. Here's how you use bind parameters. We know how to fix it. No excuse. It's right there in the IDE.
Yeah, and this becomes a learning and coaching experience, right? So as the developers are, coming up to speed, they may not have this knowledge, and so getting this timely feedback with suggested good practices behind it sort of turns into a coaching and teaching situation.
Yep, I would agree with that. And then the last slide just goes over the priority order. That's meant to show you where your highest impact and highest likelihood vulnerabilities are. With static analysis. So as you type code, this number will decrease. That's how you're fixing these issues. And you know what the priority of them is based on impact and likelihood to your code base. Injection flaws obviously would be considered critical, right? That can get at PII, whereas code quality or you're missing you're not catching an exception properly or something like that would be a low vulnerability.
Right, and just so we're here at the Micro Focus Cybersecurity Summit, and I was in a session earlier, and we're talking. This is the kinds of technologies that people are starting to gamify with their developers too, to really get them drawn in and have leaderboards on who's doing the best job at this sort of stuff, and all that's another important aspect that I think we'll see more of in the near future. So that's all we have for slides. I think we nailed it on time. That's pretty amazing.
That was awesome. Thanks, and very well described. I know nobody saw the slides. So if you have time, can you quickly go over to the Slack channel and upload that slide deck?